Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I want to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to this special solo flight edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we're confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment, quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Today's show is going to center around the notion of compromise. It's a word that's often thrown around in the kabuki theater that plays out in the nation's capital. President Obama frequently used it in his attempts to browbeat the Republicans to agree to whatever radical agenda he was pushing at the time, and it's a term that is also thrown out by the detente wing or establishment wing of the GOP. I'm sure you have all heard the compromise word oozing out of the lips of some moderate-minded individual over the years. You know, compromise can sound good. Our entire government is based off of what is known as the Great Compromise. Basically, the Great Compromise saved the entire Constitutional Convention, and perhaps even the Union itself. It was an agreement authored by Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman and called for proportional representation in the House of Representatives and originally one senator per each state. This was later changed to 2 senators from each state. We take this proportional representation for granted today, but there was a serious fear at the time that the more populous states would create a tyranny of the majority and ensure that their own special interests and concerns would win every time. The Great Compromise helped to ensure that such fears would come to naught. Another great example of compromise was the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. George Mason was concerned with the language contained in the United States Constitution. Remember, the Constitutional Convention was convened in response to the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation. The Founding Fathers had determined that the Articles of Confederation failed to adequately protect the interests of the several states, and that there was a need for a more perfect union. Despite this, many of the Founding Fathers feared that the Constitution could be construed in such a way as to take away the sovereignty delegated by the people to the states and place it solely in the hands of an intrusive central government. Mason also worried about the rights of the people being encroached upon by this new, more powerful federal government established by the new Constitution. Back in 1776, the 51-year-old Mason had been appointed to the committee tasked with drafting a Declaration of Rights for the state of Virginia. Mason concluded that a republic must begin with the formal, legally binding commitment that individuals possess unalienable rights which supersede any and all governmental authority. He carried this view into the Philadelphia Convention of 1789 and convinced James Madison to allow the inclusion of a set of restrictive and declaratory clauses to the Constitution. Of course, this set of clauses became the Bill of Rights to our Constitution. Those are examples where compromise is appropriate. However, when the sovereignty of the people would be detrimentally impacted by a supposed compromise, then compromise simply isn't an option. Jeremy and I have both mentioned the game of semantics the radical and extremist left plays. They change the meaning of words to lull the people into a false sense of security. They switch words to take the noxious edge off of their agenda, while they don't change the agenda at all. Well, the word compromise has evolved into one such weasel word in their quiver of deceit. The traditional definition of the word compromise is threefold. As a noun, it means an agreement or settlement of a dispute that is reached by each side making concessions. In its verb form, it means to settle a dispute by mutual concession, or, lastly, to accept standards that are lower than desirable. Both the Democrats and the detente wing of the GOP want to claim that conservatives never compromise. They point the finger at individuals like Ted Cruz and claim that they are why the legislative branch has been ineffective. Of course, the problem with this argument is the fact that they are not divulging the full truth. Democrats harp about compromise, but never compromise themselves. The same is true with the establishment wing of the GOP. They say that conservatives don't compromise, yet in the last several election cycles they got their way with their candidates. John McCain was a compromise, and he lost. Mitt Romney was a compromise, and he lost. A vast majority of the new members of the House and Senate from the midterm elections of 2014 were compromises, and again, they have given everything to the Obama regime without a second thought. We have to look back to the common denominator with respect to the definition of compromise. In 2 out of the 3 definitions, it calls for mutual concessions. Yet, as we have seen repeatedly, the radical left and the so-called moderate wing of the GOP have not once conceded. Conservatives have, and it has been to the great detriment of the entire country. That leaves us with the third meaning, accepting a lower standard than is desirable. All of these compromises with the left have left us in not only a lower standard than is desirable, but also a standard that is constitutionally unacceptable. When one side demands compromise from the other, but refuses any concessions on their own part, you don't have compromise. You have capitulation. The United States government is founded upon real compromise, not capitulation disguised as compromise. Yet that's what the left and detente wing of the GOP demand from conservatives. They demand we concede our most deeply held convictions, but they won't bend an inch. Is it any wonder, then, that compromise is becoming a dirty word? Think about it, folks. On Friday, October 9th, 2015, Obama has flown out to Roseburg, Oregon, the site of that ghastly shooting at Umpqua Community College, to once again demand that the American people compromise their fundamental, unalienable right to keep and bear arms. But that's the thing about unalienable rights. By their very nature, they cannot be compromised, reduced, infringed upon, or erased by any governmental authority. Because, as George Mason concluded with the Virginia Declaration of Rights, those rights are endowed by our Creator, and only the Creator has the authority to take away said rights. On top of this, President Obama is seeking to compromise the constitutional system of government by utilizing an executive order to attempt to work around the Second Amendment and the legislative branch of government. But executive orders cannot be used to redefine the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are a part of the United States Constitution, and the only way around it is to amend the Constitution in such a way as to remove the Second Amendment. That has been done in American history before, where one amendment has been passed to remove another previous amendment. In 1919, the 18th Amendment prohibiting the sale and possession of alcoholic beverages was ratified to the United States Constitution. This was known as Prohibition. However, on December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, was ratified, thereby nullifying the application and binding legal authority of the 18th Amendment. Therefore, we can see from this that this type of amendment repealing a prior amendment would be the only constitutionally authorized method of removing the right to keep and bear arms from the United States Constitution and thereby from the American citizenry. What's more, any such amendment would have to meet the requirements as set forth in the four corners of the Constitution. Pursuant to Article 5 of the Constitution, it says in pertinent part, "The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 therefore, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress." I simply do not believe that the President could meet this requirement. The Second Amendment has been a fundamental part of the United States Constitution since December of 1791. It has been a pivotal part of our government, and the people will not give up this right lightly. President Obama fully understands this, which explains why he is seeking an extra-constitutional method of depriving law-abiding citizens of their fundamental right to keep and bear arms. And it's really something that we have to concern ourselves with. Because when you look at the way that he is going outside the scope of the Constitution, it really does begin to strip all law of its meanings. And when you think about what the United States is, a nation of law, not of people, as it has been said, meaning that we are all equally bound by the laws of the United States, then when the president tries to maneuver outside of that accepted and well-established aspect of our political system, it weakens the foundations of the entire United States. Think of it. Any actions or treaties or what have you that are contrary to the clear and precise language of the Constitution are null and void and cannot be binding as law. Despite this, the President is demanding that we compromise our constitutional principles without offering any concessions. As I said before, that's not compromise. That's capitulation. Folks, we should never compromise when it comes to our unalienable rights. To do so would only lead us down the path to despotism and tyranny. All the tin-pot dictators in history, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Vladimir Lenin, sought the power to control their populations through the suppression of the right to keep and bear arms. They stripped firearms from their citizens so said citizens could not resist their radical agendas. Remember that Mao Zedong stated that political power grows from the barrel of a gun. He actually isn't too far wrong with that. When the people are stripped of their right to keep and bear arms, it allows the government to fully control every facet of their daily lives. That's exactly what this current regime wants to do. In fact, this is the sort of thing that George Mason was seeking to prevent when he convinced James Madison to include the Bill of Rights within the Constitution. The reason that Obama and the radical left in this country throw out their revised definition of compromise is because they loathe and despise the greatest compromise in American history, the United States Constitution. Folks, here's another example of those who demand compromise refusing to compromise themselves. Outgoing Speaker of the House John Boehner originally stated that he would be stepping down at the end of this month, October of 2015. Now, however, because McCarthy has withdrawn his bid for the Speaker position, John Boehner doesn't want the Conservatives to rally and muster power. Therefore, instead of compromising, allowing the Conservatives to have a chance to hold the Speaker's gavel, Boehner has delayed the vote and said that he will stay on until his successor is chosen. Look, he's trying to create the facade of compromise in the traditional sense of the word, but he's actually being uncompromising, as he has been this entire time. Not once has he compromised with conservatives. Not once has he demanded that the Obama administration compromise with him. No, he has collaborated with them, and that is why the country is in the state that she currently is. Again, they attempt to use propaganda from a willing mainstream media to paint a negative picture of those of us who want to preserve the United States Constitution. It's the same sort of rhetoric we have seen time and again. This tired trick of smoke and mirrors is getting threadbare. People are upset with the congressional GOP squandering the clear and absolute mandate that was handed to them during the midterm elections of 2014. All these grandiose promises proved to be nothing more than pure hogwash. Well, we're sick of it. Why should we compromise when it always seems to be the American people who get the raw end of the deal? Again, that's not compromise, that's forcing capitulation and servitude. I suppose the most frustrating aspect about these repeated calls for the American people to compromise their unalienable right to keep and bear firearms is the massive amount of hypocrisy from those who are demanding that law-abiding citizens give up their rights. According to the Washington Times, armed guards protect Senate Democrats while they demand new gun control laws. Folks, think about this picture for a moment. They ignore the fact that a gun-free zone created the problem in Roseburg, Oregon, and demand that we compromise and allow there to be even more gun-free zones. Where's the logic in that? All the while, they surround themselves with armed guards. Most American citizens can't afford to have armed guards. It's impractical and literally unnecessary, as we, the people, are endowed with the right to defend ourselves. Even the criminal justice system recognizes the right to self-defense. It's an absolute defense when the court finds that a person acted in self-defense. Yet these elitists want to deny us this right that we have possessed since the inception of this great republic of ours. These Senate Democrats want the citizens to compromise their rights for even more stringent background checks. Folks, people can acquire guns and have nothing show up no matter how stringent the background checks are, and become homicidal deviants later. These things don't work, and in fact, as was seen at Umpqua Community College, they actually make things worse. If anyone should have compromised in this case, it should have been Umpqua Community College, by arming their guards at the very least. But no, they want law-abiding citizens to compromise their safety so they can continue to perpetuate this utopian socialist dream that gun-free zones actually stop violence. But once again, all of the evidence on the ground shows otherwise. That's another thing, folks. How can one come to the negotiating table when the opposing side refuses to admit the facts? You can't have any sort of discussion when one of the parties is refusing to be realistic. But utopian socialists have never been realistic. They're radicals, wholeheartedly committed to their ideals, irrespective of the harm it causes others. It's almost like a religion to them. President Obama rushing to the place where the tragedy unfolded to score political points, to push an agenda? For what? What good can possibly come of this for the American people? Well, we have to remember that their agenda isn't about benefiting the American people. It all boils down to their political agenda, right or wrong. That's why President Obama rushed to the microphones 6 hours after the tragedy to push his agenda. He even stated that we should politicize these issues. No, we shouldn't. The scope and application of the Constitution should never be politicized. This isn't a discussion about law-abiding citizens being out of line, and therefore a new compromise needs to be devised. Rather, this is about a president who is upset that he can't get his own way due to the Constitution standing in his way, and now he will try anything to circumvent the supreme law of the land, which, as per Clause 2 of Article 6 of the Constitution, is the United States Constitution itself. Juliet Ilperin at the Washington Post put out a piece detailing Obama's plans to use executive orders to circumvent Congress. Now, as you know, I had mentioned this a bit earlier in the program, and I think that it does deserve a bit more reflection this time around, because literally what the president is attempting to do here, folks, is to circumvent the Constitution by circumventing the proper branch of government left in charge of this. And again, this is the president attempting to legislate. He had his chance to legislate when he was a senator. Article 1, Section 8 clearly enumerates the sole responsibility to legislate to the legislative branch. That's Congress, folks. It's the president's job, as per Article 2, to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. That means to ensure they're carried out, not to circumvent the legislature merely to push his own agenda. And see, that's the other thing. To faithfully execute the laws of the land, going back to Clause 2 of Article 6 to the United States Constitution, means that whenever he's attempting to circumvent the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution of the United States, and therefore when he attempts to infringe the Second Amendment, which is as per the preamble to the Bill of Rights, also a part of the Constitution, as well as Article 5, then the president is not faithfully executing the laws of the land. Rather, he is circumventing the laws of the land, stripping the laws of the land of their proper meaning and application and scope. And that is a true danger that we are facing here in the United States, because if we allow the president to continue in such a fashion, it will ultimately strip all law of its fundamental, well-defined meaning. And we just can't have that, because it results in anarchy and chaos. You know, going back to the fears and concerns that founding fathers like George Mason had with respect to the rights of the people and the sovereignty of the people, it's this very kind of tyranny of a majority or a minority, in either case, being able to dictate the law of the land to everyone else. When President Obama circumvents the legislative authority of Congress, which is the only constitutionally enumerated branch of government to handle legislature, he is actually creating that type of tyranny that the Founding Fathers were so adamantly opposed to. Yet, for some reason, wanting to appear as though they are attempting to compromise with their political opposition, the current majority party in the legislature is refusing to act. Not once have they really challenged this president on anything, and the few times that we have seen it, back before we even had the majority control of the Senate, when the government was shut down, they blew the PR on that. They didn't know how to forcefully get the message out so that they could drown out the accolades of the mainstream media. And the mainstream media was doing whatever it could to carry water for the Obama regime. They have been in his back pocket from day one. Again, where's the compromise there? Well, the only compromise there is their journalistic integrity being dropped to an unacceptable standard. Thus, again, applying the third definition of compromise. And it's this sort of compromise that is becoming the mainstay when anyone mentions compromise anymore within the United States government. It's not that they are sitting there speaking as to the needs of the American people, or to protecting the fundamental, unalienable rights of the American people. No. They want to strip that away, and then if ever you stand up to them, they're saying you're unwilling to compromise. It's this sort of political projection that makes Washington such a devious place. But it's not just Washington, it's politics throughout the United States. You have a party that has been hijacked by the radical extreme left, and you have their supposed opponents that are trying to run after them to become this sort of Me Too party to ensure that they're not left out of the goodies of it all, where they have illicitly amassed privileges and rights unto themselves, thereby creating a separate system of political elites. Think of a political caste system, almost, where we, the American people, are the lowest rung of the caste. We are the untouchables, the unwashed, the gullible, stupid fools who put them into power and who can be abused. But if you actually take a moment to step back and reflect upon how this nation was founded and the constitutional framework that established the tenets of federalism, you will see that it is exactly the opposite of what they have created. What was meant to be is that we, the American people, are the ultimate and supreme sovereigns of the land. But through their manipulation and through their propaganda, these radical and extreme leftists, and I'm even going to take this a step further, it's not just left-wing people, anyone who adheres and bows to the altar of statism is doing whatever they can to exponentially increase the power, scope, and reach of the central government. And that, by its nature, must come at the detriment of the American people. But that really is contrary to the Constitution. You could see it when Jeremy and I spoke of the preamble to the Bill of Rights in our previous show. You could see it when we outlined the purposes behind the Third Amendment. You'll see it in our other constitutional specials, and even in our regular shows. Folks, the reason that we talk about this so frequently is because it is of the utmost importance that you gain a working knowledge that is fluent with respect to the United States Constitution. And it's important that we all have a chance to expand our knowledge with respect to the Constitution, because through doing so, we learn what is right and what is wrong when it comes to the way our federal government, and indeed our state and local governments, operate as well. This entire tiered system, built on a true principle of compromise, was put in place, established, so that the third definition of compromise, that of the lowest standards, could not be applied to our unalienable fundamental rights. It has been a struggle since the inception of the country to determine what the proper scope and application of the federal government should be. There's always been one wing that has pushed for more dominance in the hands of the federal government, and another that believes that no, it should rest closer with the American people. Now, the overarching ideology and philosophy and logic behind the entire United States Constitution is focused upon the idea that it should rest with the people, that it is the natural law that all human beings should be the sovereigns of their lands. That is the fundamental linchpin of our entire federalist system of government. And it is a republican system of government, meaning that we elect our representatives, and that those representatives are supposed to act on our behalf. If this were a democracy, it would be a direct vote in all 50 states, on all issues, all the time. And that really wouldn't work with a nation of this size, because it could allow certain political elements to bus people around, to create a false majority, which can then outvote people and slowly strip them away of their fundamental rights. You can almost have that same thing within our system, because we do have democratic elections, but it occurs at a much slower pace than it would in a direct democracy. Now, going back to this article with respect to Obama's attempt to circumvent the legislative authority of the Congress, it says that half the people in Roseburg loved the president's idea of forcing these mandatory background checks at a federal level, especially when it comes to gun shows, while the other half don't. But what I'm getting at with this is, when you look at it, it's saying that half and half. And this kind of even-keel divide is what they say applies at every aspect of the country, in every part, that we are evenly split. And I don't really think that's the case. I think that polling can be skewed. If you ever look at a lot of the sample rates and sizes of a great many of these so-called political polls, you will find that they actually, poll such a small sample that the margin of error is beyond belief. That's not scientific. That's using the polls to skew them so that the numbers show a certain outcome. Now, not only is that intellectually disingenuous, it is done for propagandistic reasons. It's to push a message, to demoralize one side, so that once again they capitulate. All while their political opponents are out there screaming to the microphones of the mainstream media that, see, look, this is true compromise. But these radicals on the right, and that's what they do call us, those of us that actually want to adhere to the proper scope and applications and the logical principles as set out in the United States Constitution, they consider us radical. But they are the ones that are unbending, unyielding, and look, they are fighting the true progress of the country. It makes for nice platitudes, or bumper stickers, or campaign issues, but it really isn't true. The ones that are radical are those that go up in front of the microphones and say that they want to fundamentally transform the country. You know, that's not something you'd go and say to a loved one. Gee, honey, I want to fundamentally transform you. I think you're going to win a lot of respect from your significant other if you did that. Or if you have children and you go to them and say, gee, you know, you're a great kid and all, but I want to fundamentally transform you. Yeah, you're going to result with hurt feelings there as well. And it's that sort of illogic that has been driving the fundamental creed of the left. They don't want to yield. They don't want to give an inch to the American people because they have been working in a stalwart fashion for the past 100 years towards pushing their specific agenda. That being the agenda of increased governmental control, increased consolidation of power in the hands of a singular government as opposed to the governments of the several states, and to the power resting in the hands of the people. But again, when you look at the foundational documents of the United States, it's quite clear that that is not what the Founding Fathers had in mind with the establishment of this country. And for those who attempt to say that, well, look, the document is old, it's over 2 centuries old. A lot has changed in that time, and therefore it's simply antiquated or outdated. I have to say, think of it this way. The Constitution is like fine wine. It gets better with age. And that's absolutely true. Because, as I have said multiple times on this and other shows that we've done, the beautiful thing about the Constitution is that it's timeless, and that our Constitution is the longest-running Constitution in human history. And I always repeat that because I think it is such a significant thing to say. When you think about how young, relatively speaking, that the United States is, like when you compare with the histories of Europe, where some of their histories go back over 1,000 years, or the Middle East, where it goes back thousands of years, or in Asia, where it can go back, you know, about 1,000 or more years, all of a sudden, our little 240, almost 240, we'll be there in 3 years, but anyway, our 230 plus years of existence, we have established the most stable form of government that the world has ever seen. We have gone through our trials and tribulations and our difficulties, but we have managed to create a glowing example of how to govern. And this notion was a revolutionary notion when the Founding Fathers developed it. And that's why it's so strange to see that there are these groups within the country that are determined to strip that away and to replace it with a system that is failed. Socialism is a failure. There is no way around that. Redistributive programs don't work. Redistributive governments don't work. They are inherently flawed because they inherently go against the natural order of things. You see, that is what the Constitution does so beautifully. It sets out the natural order of power, the way that governance is to work in a fundamentally fair and just fashion. That is what our Founding Fathers set out to achieve when they drafted and ratified the Constitution to the United States. It was an attempt to create this more perfect union. It was an experiment at the time, But it is now, after 230-plus years, a well-established fact that these principles have worked, and therefore it seems asinine or ludicrous to move in a direction that we're attempting to strip that away from the American people, denying them their fundamental liberties, and that, after all, being what drove them to fight the War of Independence in the first place, to replace it with a failed system. Why would anyone in their right mind do that? Well, folks, I'm going to step out on a limb here and say that what these people are doing, and the people that are pushing this, is both crazy and that they are not in their right mind, that they are operating against what is in the best interests of not only the nation, but also the people. And you know, folks, there was one area where our founding fathers did not compromise. Remember that the Revolutionary War started at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, when the British regulars were coming to confiscate the arms and powders of the citizens in that area. In other words, they were trying to grab their guns, to take away their ability to defend themselves, basically denying them their fundamental right to exist. And as Niccolo Machiavelli said in The Prince, when you disarm the people, you dishonor them. And I know that I've said that before, but if you look back to the founding days of the United States, to the opening salvos of the American Revolution, the colonists did not compromise. They had compromised before, and they saw that that didn't work. You cannot compromise with tyranny and despotism. It is not possible, because if you give them an inch, they will take a mile. They do that each and every time. And we're seeing this again today, when the Republicans sit there and want to appear as this very open group that is open to working with the president. You remember, right after the midterm elections, that's what both John Boehner and Mitch McConnell said. They got up in front of the cameras and said that we need to work with the Obama administration. Except the problem is that the Obama administration refuses to compromise. So all of the compromising is going to be one-sided. And when you have one-sided compromise, that means there's no concessions. So the only compromise, once again, falls back to that third definition, which means lowering the standards for all. Like compromising the security, or the safety, or the stability of the country as a whole, particularly with respect to the fundamental rights of the people. And that's exactly what we will wind up with if we do not take a firm stance. And so that, once again, leads us to the question of, when you have all of these people on one side supposedly compromising, is that really compromise, or is that actually capitulation? Well, I think the facts at this point speak for themselves. But, you know, let's take a look at another form of compromise proposed by this administration that has directly placed America's national security in jeopardy. James Rosen, over at Fox News, has released a report that states that some senior U.S. officials involved in the implementation of the Iran nuke deal have concluded that many parts of the deal conflict with existing federal statutes. So, should we compromise and just dump the statutes or existing laws, despite horrendous concerns that this nuclear negotiation puts America at risk? And not just at risk, at significant risk? What exactly are we compromising if it isn't the safety of the American people? But that's it, folks. Again, Obama compromises on the sovereignty of the United States simply to score political points. It's imperative that we not compromise when we lack all the facts. Think about it for a minute. Would it be wise to enter into an agreement when said agreement has been made behind closed doors, and you have no idea what the fine print says? That's ludicrous. No, I'll take it a step further. That's outright stupid. Yet, that is exactly what happened with things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and that trade proposal agreement, those so-called free trade bills. Why were they held behind lock and key? Why were they denied to the American people? Why did it require smoke and mirrors for our elected representatives to go in there and to examine them? And then they can't even tell their constituents about them. That raises a question like one that was raised during the Revolution. Where is the representation in that respect? It's as though this current federal government has revised the doctrine of virtual representation and is attempting to shut the people out of it entirely. But that's what this sort of power grab always results in. It always results in the American people being the one to suffer the brunt of these ghastly consequences of statist and despotic machinations. And ever since Obama assumed the reins of power back in January of 2009, we have been facing this continual, incessant, and relentless assault on the foundational structure of our entire government. Thinking back to what he said when he wanted to fundamentally transform America, sometimes you have to wonder what exactly he meant by that. Well, the answer is this. Obama wants the power of all governmental authority to be condensed into one singular entity, that being the federal government. Preferably more power in his own hands, because he somehow believes that he is of such superior intellect that only he knows how to properly run the country. I mean, if you've ever seen the way that he acts in front of the cameras, or the type of real resistance, denial, and anger that he displays whenever anybody challenges him, it is plain to see that this man has a narcissistic streak to him. That everything has to focus upon him. And even when he came out and lampooned those of us that want to defend the Second Amendment, saying that we are radicals, he once again had to turn it in on himself as if it only mattered about him, saying that we saw this as a blatant attempt by him to take power and control. And so he used himself to push himself up and attempt to push us down in the eyes of the American people and to move forward with his agenda. It's just as he is using the tragedy that occurred at Umpqua Community College to push forth his radical agenda. Do you think he really is showing compassion to the victims? Well, as we know, most of these victims were targeted because of their faith. And it doesn't matter what you believe. No one should be targeted and killed for holding a belief, merely for holding a belief. Something that is guaranteed and protected by the First Amendment. But did the president come up and speak to the reprehensible nature of why the killer did what he did? Or the targets that the killer selected? No. He came up to the microphones and did what he has done every time. Blame an inanimate object that cannot act on its own. And that gets to Hillary Clinton coming out and stating that we need to be able to sue gun manufacturers for this. That's a products liability suit. And the problem with that is The risks inherent with guns are open and obvious. They have always been able to kill. They are not designed to prevent killing. Therefore, there's no inherent design flaw. There's no inherent manufacturing defect that would bring about strict liability for negligence. So, again, what this boils down to is that the presumptive frontrunner for the Democrats is attempting to say that if you don't perform a certain type of business we like, or if we don't politically agree with the product you're making, you should be punished out of existence. You notice she hasn't said the same thing about knife makers. But, folks, I wouldn't put it past her. I wouldn't put it past any of them, because once they go for guns, then they go for knives, and then they'll go for baseball bats, they'll go for anything. This erroneous notion that if we simply just get rid of guns, somehow all violence will stop and we'll come together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya just doesn't work. It's unrealistic. But that's why I call these radical leftists, these extremists, that are doing everything in their power to tear our constitutional system of government apart, utopian socialists. When you think of what Thomas More was trying to envision with the word utopia, its Latin roots means no place. It is no place. It cannot exist. It is unrealistic. And that is because in the human condition there cannot be anything on the scale of perfection. Perfection is impossible to obtain. Entropy will kick in. Things will slowly begin to fall apart. That's why if you're going to preserve something, or if you're going to have something last, you have to actively, proactively maintain it. Well, the same thing holds true for your unalienable fundamental rights. You have to proactively maintain them, because there is no perfection, but we came close to it with the Constitution, as it is based on natural law principles and divinely inspired. But because it is a product of humanity and of this physical world, it requires a proactive maintenance on the part of the people, as the people are the true holders of sovereignty, as it was always intended to be that way. But the political powers that be, these nefarious utopian socialists, have ingrained themselves into the system so much, infiltrated the media, education, even some of the scientific groups, like with this hoax known as global warming, to push their agenda. They came into this with an idea of, I'm not going to find instant gratification, but I will set out on 100 or 130-year plan to see my goals achieved. That's what's so dangerous about things like the Marxist dialectic. You know, the Marxist goals don't just look at one point in time. They try to look at the future, whenever that may be. And it, by its nature, requires violent revolution. That's the other aspect of Marxism. But you know where Marx got everything wrong is he said everything in history is linearly progressive. Linearly progressive history does not happen. History is cyclical. It always has been. And that is another reason why the people must be proactive in the maintenance of their liberties and freedoms. Because the Marxist types that'll play these semantic games where they try and redefine the meaning of freedom and liberty will strip them of their unalienable rights, because Marxism, by its nature, denies the existence of natural law principles. Both Marx and Engels stated as such. And they were also completely against what makes society stable and able to function. Marx was diametrically opposed to the family, which is the fundamental building block of any and all societies. He absolutely detested and despised the institution of marriage. And might that also address to why the Supreme Court went in and redefined marriage? Now, of course, they're going to say that they didn't, but they did. And this after they had made a decision before to shoot down a law they didn't like that had defined marriage, because they said that the federal government couldn't define marriage and must accept the definitions by certain states that had same-sex marriage within their definitions, to then say that those states that excluded it could not because the federal government said so, misinterpreting the 14th Amendment. Well, you see, there's a contradiction in logic there, and it's one that they say we have to, once again, compromise on. But folks, at what point, again, does compromise become capitulation? Because I have a feeling that what we're facing here, what we're seeing throughout all of this, is that we're actually starting to hit not compromise, but sheer and unadulterated capitulation. That is what the federal government is demanding from us. It is what they are trying to strip from us. And it doesn't work. Let's take a look at another form of compromise proposed by this regime with that nuclear deal. And I know that I'd mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I got off of it. When we are talking about this nuclear deal, we're looking at the fact that they are telling us that we should accept what they say at face value. Yet, this deal, this nuclear deal, was done behind closed doors. And because Obama wanted to once again utilize the third definition of compromise, and thereby weaken the structure of our system, he pushed it through in the form of an executive action, or an executive agreement, in this case, which is not a treaty. So, that means he has also not received a single vote of ratification from the Congress, either explicitly or implicitly. Therefore, thanks to court precedent which held that United States law, in the form of statutes, trump executive agreements, this entire Iran nuclear deal is vulnerable to legal attack, and rightly so. Yet, there's room for Obama to compromise again. But how? Well, he could go forward with the agreement and allow foreign subsidiaries to be treated differently than U.S. parent firms. So, again, weakening the part of the company that's here in the United States, allowing the subsidiaries to grow stronger. Well, that would make Obama extremely happy. After all, he's gone on those multiple apology tours saying how wicked and wrong the United States is to have amassed wealth, to have created this great republic, which has been a shining beacon for liberty for generations. No, he wants to weaken that. Or, to use his terms, fundamentally transform, and he expects the rest of us to compromise by bowing down. In his mind, what compromise is that we just accept everything that he says as the gospel truth, the way things were always meant to be, and there's obviously something wrong with us if we refuse to agree with his vision of the world and of the United States. But that's not how the world really works. And the president is being inflexible, intolerable, incorrigible here, with the way that he's been handling things, with the way that he has gone out and politicized tragedy, stepping on the graves of those innocent souls who lost their lives, many just for simply holding a faith, a belief. And then he's going to sit there and try and circumvent Congress to get this nuclear deal with Iran, when Iran comes out on these videos after each time that we've negotiated with them to call us the Great Satan and to demand the death of our citizens? Have we really forgotten what happened to our hostages in 1979 and what Iran did? Have we really forgotten that Iran has been the #1 funder of terrorism for decades? Folks, these people have funded those who are out for our blood. And yes, while they may be fighting with ISIS now, do not think that they could not unite and come together to fight a common enemy. And in their eyes, both ISIS and Iran, being flip sides of the same Islamic coin, view America and our values and our Constitution as wicked and as something that should not exist within the world. And they will do whatever it takes. You want to talk about a group that won't compromise? It is these Islamic extremists that are out to kill us. But what does our president do? Well, he takes away this notion that we don't negotiate with terrorists. Okay, there's a compromise. He gives up 5 of the masterminds of terrorist attacks all over through Al-Qaeda from Gitmo to trade for Bo Bergdahl, who left his military post seeking to contact the Taliban, a sworn enemy of the United States, and that's who he gave these people in exchange for. Gee, there's another compromise. Now, he's refusing to compromise where it could be good and allowing funding to go forward with the Pentagon and for national defense, demanding that we close Gitmo. But again, that is outside the scope of his enumerated powers pursuant to Article 2 to the United States Constitution. And there's no way around that. There really isn't, but he's trying. And you know, it's funny, the left always wants the right to compromise. But when it comes to things like the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, the left voted lockstep and refused to even consider alterations to the bill. In fact, their uncompromising ways hoodwinked the American people, crushing them under the weight of this monstrosity of a bill. The only thing that got compromised was America's standard of care and the freedom of the people. When Chief Justice John Roberts compromised twice in the Supreme Court through the individual mandate, he allowed Americans to be taxed for doing nothing. That's the first time in our nation's history that something like that has ever happened. He compromised and allowed the government to take control of over 8.7% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. That's staggering, folks, yet that's exactly what happens when we compromise our principles. You know, what's the major difference between the Great Compromise at the founding of our nation and all of these new pseudo-compromises that the left and moderates want us to accept? The Great Compromise had a vision for a strong and free people. These new pseudo-compromises are composed of baby steps towards totalitarianism. They are inching us back to the sort of despotism and tyranny our forefathers fought tooth and nail to free us from. People forget that the entire span of the Revolutionary War, starting with the opening shots in 1775, then the official start of the war in 1776, and it didn't end until 1781. Folks, that is a long time to fight. And you have to remember that they were fighting the most powerful military force known to man at the time. So, they fought to free us from that, and now we're compromising our way back in to the very chains and shackles that the Founding Fathers fought so hard to get us away from. I think what we really need to do is ask ourselves whether these so-called compromises are actually compromise or capitulation. I think the answer is pretty clear. This is not compromise. This is capitulation. And with that said, it's now time for our descent. Once again, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to personally thank you for joining us today. Really, folks, we do appreciate this. We couldn't do it without you. In fact, we do all of this for you. And we are grateful for you joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. So sit back, relax, enjoy yourselves as we bring it home. Thank you again for flying the Wright Flyer.